March 1943. The waters north of New Guinea glimmered beneath a false calm. Across that endless blue, a Japanese convoy, 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers, moved like a steel serpent toward La, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers. Their mission: reinforce Japan's crumbling front in New Guinea. They sailed believing the sky was theirs. The Imperial Navy had ruled the Pacific for years. No one expected what was coming. At 7:30 a.m., March 3rd, the calm shattered. From the west roared dozens of American B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and RAF Beaufighters sweeping in at mast height. The convoy's guns erupted, but it was too late. Bombs and 500-pound depth charges turned the sea into a storm of fire and oil. In less than 48 hours, the Japanese lost 8 transports for destroyers and over 3,500 men, wiped out in one of the most decisive air-sea ambushes of World War II. Japan called it a massacre. The Allies called it revenge for the Pacific. And from that day, the Empire of the Rising Sun learned that no ocean and no darkness could hide them from the eyes in the sky. Early 1943. The Pacific War had turned against Japan, quietly but unmistakably. After the brutal campaign on Guadalcanal, the once invincible imperial forces were bleeding men and ships. The empire that had swept through the Pacific now faced a new kind of enemy, one that learned fast, struck from the sky, and never fought fair. In the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Japanese 18th Army was trapped. Cut off by Allied landings and constant air attacks, their supply lines ran dangerously thin. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, the front at La, Japan's key stronghold, would collapse. The solution came from Rabaul, Japan's main base in the Southwest Pacific. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura received a direct order from Tokyo: deliver reinforcements to La at all costs. Kimura assembled Operation 81, a convoy of 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers, carrying 6,912 soldiers, ammunition, and supplies. Among the troops were veterans of the 51st Division, proud men who had fought in China and Malaya. They believed the voyage would be routine, but the seas they were about to cross, the narrow Bismarck Sea, were watched. On the opposite side of the Pacific, General George C. Kinney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, was waiting. Operating from airfields at Port Moresby and Dobadura, his pilots had been honing new tactics: skip bombing, mast-height attacks, and coordinated strike waves. Kinney's intelligence officers, working with Australian codebreakers at Fromel Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, had intercepted the Japanese plans days earlier. They knew everything: the number of ships, the route, even the date of departure. "We didn't just want to hit them," Kinney later said. "We wanted to erase them." By March 1st, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy moving south from Rabaul, threading between New Britain and New Ireland under thick tropical clouds. The hunt was on. The Japanese ships plowed through rough seas, gray water slapping their bows. Destroyers Shirayuki, Arashio, Tokitsuke's, and Yukike's cut ahead, their lookouts scanning for enemy aircraft. Aboard the transports, soldiers slept in cargo holds packed with trucks, guns, and crates of rice. They believed they were safe, the weather was poor, and the Imperial Navy still ruled the Bismarck Sea. In the cramped bridge of the flagship Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura stood over a chart lit by red lamplight. "We will reach La in 2 days," he told his officers. "The Americans cannot find us." But above the clouds, they already had. At dawn on March 2nd, a B-24 Liberator from the 321st Squadron sighted the convoy moving southwest of New Britain. The crew radioed in coordinates before diving back into cloud cover to escape anti-aircraft fire. Within hours, the 5th Air Force was on full alert. Kinney assembled a strike force unlike anything seen before. B-17 Flying Fortresses for high-altitude bombing, B-25 Mitchells, and A-20 Havocs for low-level attacks, P-38 Lightnings for escort and pursuit, and RAF Beaufighters for strafing runs. It was a combined American-Australian operation, one of the first in the Pacific War. That afternoon, B-17s launched from Port Moresby. At 10,000 feet, they found the convoy moving in tight formation, destroyers weaving to protect the transports. Bombs fell through heavy clouds. The first missed, the second struck true. A transport ship, Kyakusi Maru, took a direct hit and exploded. As she sank beneath the waves, 1,200 soldiers went into the sea. Japanese destroyers Yukike's and Asagumo turned back to rescue survivors, unaware they had just sealed their fate. By nightfall, the convoys scattered and regrouped, slower now, fewer guns, and terrified sailors scanning the horizon. Kimura knew they had been spotted, but his orders were clear: reach La or die trying. Meanwhile, at Port Moresby, Allied pilots prepared for dawn. The airfields buzzed with activity, engines warming, bombs being loaded, tracer belts being fed into guns. Lieutenant Colonel Jock Hennebury, leading the 90th Bombardment Squadron, briefed his men with a grin. "We're going to hit them so low, we'll get sea spray in our faces." They would attack at mast height, a new tactic pioneered just weeks earlier at Oro Bay. Instead of dropping bombs from altitude, the B-25s would skim the waves, releasing their payloads like torpedoes, bombs that would skip off the surface and detonate against ship hulls. It was daring, it was suicidal, and it was about to rewrite the book on naval warfare. That night, tropical rain lashed the Bismarck Sea. Aboard the Japanese transports, soldiers huddled on deck, smoking under the awnings, unaware that the storm above was the only thing hiding them. Some wrote in diaries, others played cards or sang. They joked about arriving in La by sunrise, where the Emperor's sake and music would greet them. In the blackness, one destroyer lookout thought he saw faint flashes of lightning far to the south, but it wasn't lightning. It was the exhaust flare of American bombers climbing into the sky. As the convoy pressed on into March 3rd, the horizon began to lighten. The rain stopped, the sky cleared, and then silence. No ships on the radar, no warning from above, until, out of the rising sun, came the glint of wings. From that moment on, there would be no hiding, no mercy, and no escape. In less than 24 hours, the Japanese 18th Army's proudest division would vanish beneath fire and foam, victims of the most devastating air-sea ambush of the Pacific War. The stage was set, the hunters were airborne, and the Bismarck Sea was waiting. March 3rd, 1943. The sun rose over the Bismarck Sea like a blade, sharp, merciless, and blinding. Below, Admiral Masatomi Kimura's convoy pushed steadily toward La, unaware that hundreds of Allied aircraft were converging on its position. At 8 a.m., Allied reconnaissance confirmed. Convoy sighted. 15 ships heading southeast at 10 knots. In the skies over Port Moresby, engines roared to life. Rosa B, 25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocs, and RAF Beaufighters taxied into position, their pilots silent, faces set with grim focus. General George C. Kenney's plan was simple and deadly. Hit the convoy from every altitude, every direction, and every second. The B-17s would bomb from above, forcing ships to scatter. Then, low-level attackers would strike at mast height, strafing bridges and gunners before skipping bombs across the waves. No formation had ever attempted a coordinated attack like this before. It would become a textbook example of precision chaos. At 10 a.m., the first wave arrived, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses from the 43rd Bomb Group. From 7,000 feet, they began their run. Bombs away, the sky filled with black puffs as Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Shells burst in symmetrical rings, but the B-17s held steady, releasing strings of 500-pound bombs that rained down in perfect intervals. Explosions ripped through the sea, sending columns of water and fire into the air. The transport Tio Maru took a direct hit amidships. Her fuel stores ignited, turning her into a flaming torch. Aboard nearby destroyer Horatio, gunners watched in horror as soldiers jumped from the burning deck into the oil-slicked sea. Moments later, the second wave arrived, 13 Australian Bristol Beaufighters from a number 30 Squadron RAF, sweeping in barely 100 feet above the water. They came in fast and low, flying parallel to the waves so tightly that Japanese lookouts mistook them for incoming torpedoes. At mast height, the Beaufighters opened up with their 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 machine guns. The convoy erupted in flame and metal. Bridges were shredded, gun crews cut down, and communication lines severed in seconds. Destroyers like Shirayuki and Tokitsuke's fired blindly into the haze, their gunners unable to track the blurs skimming across the water. One Beaufighter pilot, Flying Officer Fred Pappy Gorey, later recalled, "We could see men diving overboard. We weren't there to hate them, but we had a job to do, and that sea had to burn." As the Beaufighters finished their strafing runs, the B-25 Mitchells of the 90th Bomb Squadron came roaring in, the first to unleash the new weapon of choice, skip bombs. Flying just 200 feet above the surface, they released 500-pound bombs that ricocheted across the waves like stones, striking ship hulls before detonating on contact. It was devastating. The transport Kyakusei Maru, already damaged, broke apart under multiple hits. The destroyer Shuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was struck amidships. Flames engulfed her superstructure, and her magazine exploded, splitting her in two. Eyewitnesses from A-20 Havocs circling overhead described the moment. 1 second there was a destroyer, the next, only fire and a shadow in the water. For 2 hours, the air and sea became one inferno. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft dove through smoke and tracer fire. A-20 Havocs strafed decks, setting lifeboats ablaze. P-38 Lightnings weaved between ships, picking off survivors clinging to wreckage. Even when the Japanese guns found their mark, shooting down 2 Allied planes, it did nothing to stem the assault. The convoy was disintegrating. Transports Oigawa Maru, Io Maru, and Taime Maru went down in succession. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the water, capsizing lifeboats and shredding rafts. One Japanese survivor, Sergeant Sadao Yamazaki, would later write from captivity, "The sea boiled with men and oil. The sky burned red. There was nowhere to swim that did not lead to death." Admiral Kimura, now aboard destroyer Shikinami, refused to retreat. He signaled the remaining ships to press toward La, a doomed order, but one born from honor. As he turned to coordinate rescue operations, a flight of 20 Havocs struck the convoy's southern flank. One 500-pound bomb hit Tokitsuke's stern, blowing off her propellers and sending her drifting helplessly. Kimura stood on the bridge, watching smoke rise in thick black towers across the sea. What had started as a mission of reinforcement had become a massacre. "The enemy owns the air," one officer whispered. "No," Kimura replied, staring at the burning horizon. "They own everything." By noon, only a handful of ships were still afloat. Destroyers Shikinami, Asagamo, and Yukike's zigzagged through wreckage, trying desperately to save survivors while dodging strafing runs. Allied bombers circled overhead, methodically finishing off crippled transports. When the Oigawa Maru sank, it took nearly 1,000 soldiers with it. Fuel slicks burned across miles of open sea, a floating graveyard stretching from Cape Wardhunt to La. As the last wave of Allied bombers withdrew, silence returned, except for the hiss of burning oil and the cries of men in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over, but the killing had just begun. When darkness fell, Japanese destroyers crept back to rescue survivors, unaware that Allied aircraft would return at dawn to finish what they had started. Out of 8 transports, none survived. Out of 8 destroyers, 4 sunk or crippled. Over 3,500 soldiers and sailors were dead. For Japan, it was an unthinkable loss, a single strike that crippled their New Guinea campaign. And for the Allies, it was proof that air power had changed the face of war forever. Night fell slowly over the Bismarck Sea, but the fires didn't fade. They floated on the waves, long, shimmering trails of oil and flame stretching across the horizon. The sea was littered with wreckage, shattered lifeboats, floating helmets, burned timbers, and the motionless bodies of thousands of men who had once believed they were the Empire's best. Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the deck of Shikanami, the smell of burning fuel heavy in the air. His surviving destroyers circled through the darkness, searchlights slicing across the waves, pulling survivors from the water. They found hundreds, but not nearly enough. The ocean was filled with cries. Men clung to planks and debris, whispering prayers to Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Others drifted silently, faces turned to the night sky. By midnight, Kimura ordered radio silence and rescue operations to continue at dawn. He didn't know the Americans were already preparing to return. At first light, March 4th, 1943, the Allied airfields at Dobadura and Port Moresby came alive again. Reconnaissance flights spotted 4 destroyers still in the area, surrounded by survivors and burning ships. General George Kenney gave a cold order. Hit them again. Leave nothing afloat. At 8 a.m., A. 20 Havocs and B. 25 Mitchells launched from New Guinea, escorted by P. 38 Lightnings. They found the scene just as the reports described. Thousands of men still in the water, clinging to wreckage, destroyers weaving desperately among them. The first bombs fell without warning. Columns of spray rose among the survivors. The sea, already slick with oil, caught fire again. Destroyer Asagamo took a near miss. Shikanami was strafed as she dragged survivors aboard. Even the rescue boats were targeted. Any vessel that moved drew fire. It was one of the most controversial acts of the Pacific War. The Allies didn't just destroy the convoy. They erased it. By noon, it was over. Of the 6,912 soldiers originally bound for La, only 1,200 would reach land alive. More than 3,500 were killed outright. Hundreds more drowned or were lost to the sea. Worse still, the waters around the wrecks churned with fins, sharks drawn by the blood and debris. Survivors who had escaped the flames now faced a new terror below the surface. One Japanese officer, Lieutenant Kazuo Tanaka, would later write from a hospital bed in Rabaul. We saw the sky fall upon us. Ships burned like lanterns on the sea. Men cried for their mothers. And then the water began to eat them. For Japan, the numbers were unthinkable. 8 transports and 4 destroyers gone. The largest single loss of shipping in the New Guinea campaign. Dozens of pilots and experienced sailors lost forever. In just 48 hours, a force meant to strengthen Japan's front had been obliterated. In Rabaul, Japanese command waited for news. Hour after hour, no reports came. Finally, a garbled transmission broke through static. It was Admiral Kimura. Convoy destroyed, most ships sunk, few survivors. The line went dead. The message reached Tokyo by midnight. For the first time since Midway, the Imperial General Headquarters fell into stunned silence. No officer dared speak. The next morning, official reports downplayed the losses, claiming only heavy damage and some ships missing. But within days, intelligence from New Guinea painted a grim reality. Japan had lost not only men and ships, but the very ability to reinforce its front lines. The Empire's expansion in the South Pacific had officially ended, and no one dared admit aloud. Across the Pacific, the Allies celebrated. Headlines blared. Entire Japanese convoy annihilated in the Bismarck Sea. U.S. and Australian flyers smash enemy fleet. Radio broadcasts praised the daring of Kenney's pilots and the precision of their attacks. Footage taken from gun cameras showed bombs skipping across the waves and detonating against ships, a shocking, cinematic vision of modern air power. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold called it a perfect demonstration of coordinated air attack. In London, Winston Churchill reportedly remarked, "This is how empires are undone, not by the sword but by the sky." The success validated Kenney's experimental tactics. Skip bombing became the new standard for low-altitude assault, and the message to Japan was clear. Even in their own seas, they were no longer safe. But in Japan, the reaction was very different. The loss of 3,500 men and 12 warships in a single strike was a humiliation the Imperial Navy could scarcely comprehend. The press was censored. Casualty numbers were never published. Families of the 51st Division received only vague telegrams. Your son fought bravely for the Emperor and died gloriously in battle. Behind closed doors, the Naval General Staff raged. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, reportedly slammed his fist on the table when the report reached him. "We have lost not just ships," he said, "but faith. Faith that our empire can defend its sons." The loss shattered morale among Japan's frontline troops. For the first time, whispers spread through the ranks that the war might not be winnable. In the days that followed, Japanese destroyers returned to collect the dead. Bodies floated for miles, some still clutching rifles, others burned beyond recognition. Aboard the recovery ships, sailors wept openly. The sea that had once carried Japan's conquests now held its fallen. Even decades later, divers who explored the wrecks near Cape Ward Hunt found haunting reminders: rusted helmets, melted machine guns, twisted beams where men once stood. The sea had become their grave. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over, but its echoes reached far beyond the Pacific. For the Allies, it marked the triumph of air power. For Japan, it was a wound that would never truly heal. But for the men who were there, on both sides, it was something else entirely. A moment when courage met annihilation, and the ocean itself became the battlefield. The smoke from the Bismarck Sea still hung in the air when the news reached General Douglas MacArthur at his headquarters in Brisbane, Australia. He listened silently as his intelligence chief read the report. Enemy convoy destroyed. Estimated loss: 3,500 killed. No Allied ships lost. MacArthur removed his pipe, exhaled slowly, and said only one word: "Excellent." To him, it wasn't just a victory. It was validation, proof that air power, not fleets, would decide the future of the Pacific War. From that day forward, the sky became his navy. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed everything. Until then, air attacks on shipping had been experimental, often inaccurate and dangerous. But the success of skip bombing, perfected by Kenny's 5th Air Force, showed that aircraft could sink entire fleets without the support of a single warship. Within weeks, Allied commands across the Pacific began redesigning their tactics. Bombers were retrofitted for low-altitude attack. Pilots were trained to fly wave-hugging approaches under enemy radar. Combined air formations, fighters, bombers, and strafers, became the standard. At Port Moresby, Kenny addressed his squadrons with pride. "Gentlemen, you've done what battleships could not. You've turned the ocean into our battlefield." For the first time, the Allies had full control of the air lanes to New Guinea. Every Japanese convoy that dared to move by day was now a target. In Tokyo, the shock was still sinking in. The Bismarck Sea wasn't just a defeat. It was a revelation of Japan's vulnerability. The Imperial Navy launched an immediate inquiry. How had Allied aircraft known the convoy's exact route and timing? How could unescorted bombers have destroyed destroyers, ships designed specifically to fight aircraft? Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the Naval General Staff's Operations Division, wrote, "The loss at Bismarck was not due to lack of courage, but lack of understanding. We no longer control the air. And without air, we could not control the sea." From March 1943 onward, all major Japanese troop movements to New Guinea were conducted only at night. Convoys hugged coastlines, using tropical storms and darkness for cover. Even then, few made it through. What was once a proud invasion route became known among Japanese sailors as the Sea of No Return. The consequences were immediate. With reinforcements destroyed, Japanese troops already stranded in New Guinea began to starve. The 18th Army supply lines broke completely. Soldiers at La, Salamaua, and Wewak were forced to survive on half rations, sometimes eating roots, insects, and even leather belts. Allied air patrols struck any barge or small transport they spotted. Every attempt to rebuild the supply chain ended in flames. A captured Japanese diary from the 51st Division read, "We are alone now. The sea burns when the sun rises. No ship will come for us. The once unstoppable Japanese advance in the Southwest Pacific had reached its limit, not because of armies, but because of air supremacy. For General MacArthur, the path forward was clear. With Japanese reinforcements cut off, he could now move northward, island by island, toward the Philippines. The Bismarck Sea became the first domino in a chain of victories that followed. La and Salamaua fell in September 1943. New Britain was isolated by early 1944, and by mid-1944, Allied bombers were striking the Philippines itself. Each success was built on the same principle born in the Bismarck Sea: hit them before they land and hit them from the air. MacArthur later wrote in his memoirs, "The sea no longer belonged to the enemy. Our airmen had conquered it." For Japan, the emotional toll was devastating. Families of the lost soldiers never learned the truth. The Imperial Navy refused to release casualty figures, fearing public panic. Temples across Kyushu, Hiroshima, and Nagoya quietly held memorials for the fallen of the South Seas. But no one dared speak of how they died. Survivors who returned from Rabaul were ordered not to talk about the battle. Some officers, consumed by guilt, took their own lives. The Bismarck Sea had become a national shame, hidden behind propaganda headlines about heroic sacrifice. Yet within Japan's officer corps, the lesson was painfully clear. The age of battleships was over. In Washington, analysts studied every detail of the battle. The results stunned even the most seasoned strategists. In just 2 days, Allied aircraft had destroyed 12 Japanese ships totaling over 40,000 tons, 3,500 troops and sailors, and all without losing a single ship of their own. Naval historians later called it the end of the surface fleet era. For the U.S. and Australia, it proved that air dominance could do what entire fleets could not: control oceans, isolate armies, and destroy logistics with surgical precision. The tactics pioneered there, skip bombing, coordinated altitude waves, low-level strafing, became a foundation for future operations across the Pacific from Biak to Leyte Gulf. Among the Allied pilots who fought there, few ever forgot what they saw. Lieutenant Dick Baum, America's future top ace, later said, "It wasn't a battle, it was slaughter. We did what had to be done, but no one cheered when it was over." For many airmen, the sight of burning ships and men in the sea haunted them long after the war. Victory had come at the cost of witnessing devastation on a scale they had never imagined. Back home, newspapers printed headlines of triumph, but the pilots who returned rarely spoke of it. In the quiet of veterans' bars and empty hangars, they called it the Sea of Ghosts. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became more than a victory. It became a warning. It showed what happened when technology outpaced tradition, when courage met innovation, and when war leapt from the sea into the sky. And though Japan would fight on for 2 more brutal years, its fate had already been sealed. Here, in the waters north of New Guinea, where a single American strike wiped out an army and changed the future of naval warfare forever. War is made of numbers. Ships sunk, tons of bombs dropped, men lost. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a statistic. It was lived second by second by men who had no time to think, only to act, to fight, and to survive. And decades later, their memories would tell the story better than any report ever could. Lieutenant Colonel John Jacques Hennebrey of the 90th Bombardment Squadron led one of the first B-25 squadrons into the attack that morning. At 200 feet above the sea, tracer rounds streaked past his cockpit like angry sparks. He shouted into the intercom, "Hold it steady. Pick your target." Ahead, a Japanese destroyer flashed by, a black shape throwing up white water as its guns erupted. Hennebrey released 2 500-pound bombs. They skipped once, twice, and vanished under the ship's bow. A heartbeat later, an explosion tore through the stern. His gunner yelled, "We got her!" But Hennebrey didn't celebrate. He could see men leaping into the sea, the destroyer's deck tilting upward, flames licking her hull. "You didn't cheer," he said years later. "You just flew on." It wasn't joy, it was shock. Nearby, Captain Tom Lynch, flying a B-25 nicknamed Hell's Winch, strafed one of the transports. His bombs struck amidships. The explosion threw debris high into the air, peppering his plane's wings. It was like flying through a volcano, he recalled. The air was full of fire and smoke and screams. Each pilot returned to base with the same expression. Not triumph, but disbelief. They had witnessed something beyond battle. Something absolute. Below, the men of the 51st Division never saw the first bombs coming. Private Masao Watanabe, barely 20 years old, was standing on deck when the first explosions hit. The sky turned red, he later wrote. The sea rose up to swallow the ship. Thrown overboard, he clung to a piece of wood, surrounded by burning oil. He saw soldiers struggling in the water, some shouting for help, others silent. When a transport nearby exploded, the wave knocked him beneath the surface. The sea was hot, he said. It burned my skin. I thought I was already dead. For sailors aboard Shirayuki, it was chaos. Petty Officer Kenji Sato remembered. We fired everything we had. The air was full of planes. They came from every direction. You couldn't tell where to aim. They were too fast, too low. When a bomb hit the magazine, the explosion threw Sato into the sea. When he surfaced, there was no ship, only debris. I saw my captain's sword floating near me. I wanted to grab it, but I couldn't move my arm. Hours later, he was picked up by Yukike's, one of the few destroyers still afloat. Of his entire crew, fewer than 50 survived. Among the RAF Beaufighter pilots, that morning was Flight Lieutenant Russell Rusty Lemon of No. 30 Squadron. He flew so low that his wingtips nearly skimmed the waves. His job was to silence the convoy's guns before the bombers moved in. We came in at 50 feet, Lemon said. The ships looked like floating cities. You could see the men running on deck. Then we opened up, cannons and machine guns. The bridges just vanished. His Beaufighter took hits from anti-aircraft fire. A shell exploded near the nose, shattering the canopy. But he held course, finishing his run before pulling up through smoke. You didn't think about dying. You thought about the next second, the next target. That's all. When he landed at Dobadura, his aircraft was leaking oil and riddled with holes. The ground crew counted nearly 40 bullet strikes. When the shooting stopped, the sea was unrecognizable. Smoke rose in pillars. The surface was slick with oil and dotted with burning wrecks. Thousands of men floated amid the debris, some alive, most not. An Australian pilot, Warrant Officer Doug Clark, remembered circling above the chaos. You could see the men in the water waving, but we couldn't help. We had our orders. It was war, and mercy wasn't part of it. For the Japanese survivors, rescue was agony. Destroyers that returned to save them came under renewed attack. One sailor wrote, "Every time we pulled a man from the water, another bomb fell. The sea turned black again. By the time the sun set, the Bismarck Sea had become a graveyard." After the war, survivors on both sides spoke rarely of the battle. For the Americans and Australians, it was a military success, but few could forget the horror they had witnessed. For the Japanese, it was an unspoken trauma. Letters from the dead arrived home months later, still censored, still filled with empty promises of victory. In 1953, at a veterans gathering in Tokyo, former Petty Officer Sato met an American pilot who had flown over the same sea that day. They stood in silence for a long time. Then Sato said quietly, "You were doing your duty. So were we." The American nodded. Neither spoke again. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a clash of machines. It was a collision of faith, pride, and humanity. It marked the moment when technology turned warfare into annihilation, when courage, no matter how fierce, could no longer defy the sky. And though time would bury the details beneath maps and medals, the men who fought there would carry it forever. The day when the sea caught fire and the war changed forever. When the smoke finally cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the wrecks of Japan's ambition floated silently beneath the waves. What had begun as a routine troop transport ended as a catastrophe that would echo across the entire Pacific. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been utterly defeated, not by ships, but by aircraft, and the implications were staggering. In Tokyo, the news hit like a thunderclap. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had commanded the convoy, returned to Rabaul under a shroud of shame. Of the 6,900 soldiers he had attempted to deliver to La, fewer than 1,200 reached their destination alive. The rest were swallowed by the sea. Japanese naval staff convened an emergency meeting within 48 hours. Reports described the complete destruction of 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Intelligence officers called it a massacre by air. The reaction from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was one of controlled fury. "The sea, once our shield, has become our grave," he said grimly. Japan had lost not just ships, but something far greater, its illusion of invincibility in the Pacific. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a victory. It was proof of a new doctrine, one that would define the rest of the war. General George C. Kenney, commander of the U.S. 5th Air Force, had long believed that precision, low-level attacks could cripple enemy convoys. At Bismarck Sea, his vision was vindicated. The battle showcased a revolutionary tactic: skip bombing, where pilots dropped bombs at low altitude so they bounced across the water into ships. It had been inspired by Australian experiments and perfected in secret training runs. Now, it had destroyed an entire fleet. Reports from the Allied command were almost incredulous. "Never before," wrote one observer, "has an air force annihilated a naval force in open water." The results were undeniable. Japan could no longer reinforce its New Guinea front by sea. Every convoy after that sailed under the shadow of fear. Before the battle, the Japanese High Command had pinned their hopes on holding La and Salamaua, key positions on the northern coast of New Guinea. From there, they planned to threaten Port Moresby and eventually Australia itself. But with the destruction of Kimura's convoy, that dream disintegrated overnight. Without reinforcements, Japan's troops in La were left stranded, starving, cut off from supplies, and harassed by constant Allied air raids. By September 1943, the city fell to Australian and American forces. The tide of the Pacific War had turned, not through grand naval battles, but through a single, devastating strike in the sky. The victory at the Bismarck Sea paved the way for Operation Cartwheel, the massive Allied strategy to isolate and neutralize the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William F. Halsey both cited the battle as a turning point. MacArthur called it the decisive aerial engagement of the New Guinea campaign. Halsey simply said, "We finally owned the sky." From mid-1943 onward, Allied air forces dominated the South Pacific. Japanese convoys stopped sailing in daylight. Their pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, were forced onto the defensive. And beneath that shifting sky, the myth of Japanese naval supremacy began to crumble. In the years that followed, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a case study in military academies around the world. It demonstrated that control of the air meant control of the sea, a lesson that shaped every modern navy thereafter. The U.S. Navy and Air Force studied the battle's data meticulously. Attack altitude, 200 feet. Bombing angle, 5 to 10 degrees. Success rate, over 70% hits in skip bombing runs. Casualties, minimal compared to the scale of destruction inflicted. For Japan, the lesson was painful but clear. No matter how strong your fleet, no warship could survive without air cover. In diaries recovered after the war, Japanese officers described the shock that followed. Captain Minoru Oda, stationed at Rabaul, wrote, "The sea no longer belongs to us. Every voyage feels like suicide." New orders soon followed. Convoys to La were to be abandoned. Troops would now attempt reinforcement by submarine or small craft under cover of night, a desperate measure that could never replace what was lost. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been humbled, not by battleships but by bombers. For General Kenney's airmen, victory carried a strange silence. The pilots who returned to Port Moresby celebrated, but few smiled for long. They had seen the results of their work: thousands of men adrift, ships torn apart, the sea itself burning. In his memoirs, Kenney wrote, "We proved that air power could stop an army. but it was a terrible proof. The war would go on for 2 more brutal years, but the message was already written in history. The Pacific was no longer Japan's domain. It belonged to the sky. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea didn't just mark a victory. It marked the birth of a new era of warfare. It turned the ocean into a battlefield of shadows, where the enemy could strike from beyond the horizon. And as both sides rebuilt and prepared for what came next, the Allies pushing toward Rabaul and Japan digging deeper into desperation, one truth became clear. In modern war, whoever owns the sky owns the world. The war moved on. New battles erupted across the Pacific: Tarawa, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, each more brutal than the last. But for those who were there, the memory of the Bismarck Sea never faded. To them, it wasn't just another victory or loss. It was the day the ocean itself caught fire, when the sea, sky, and humanity collided in one unforgettable storm. Today, beneath the blue calm of the Bismarck Sea, the wrecks still rest, silent tombs of iron and memory. Divers have found the skeletal remains of Japanese transports like Kyakusia Maru and Io Maru, their decks split open, cargo still scattered across the seabed. Some lie upright, their guns still aimed toward the surface. Others are twisted and broken, wrapped in coral claimed by time. Japanese families still come to these waters to offer prayers. Small paper cranes drift in the current, carried away by the same sea that once devoured their sons. In 1946, General George Kenney returned to Australia and visited the graves of the pilots who never came home. He placed a small bouquet at each site and whispered, "You changed the course of the war." But the pilots themselves, those who survived, rarely spoke about it. To them, victory had a face, the face of the men they saw falling into the sea, the ships they saw burning. Lieutenant Colonel Jock Hennebrey later told a reporter, "It was the proudest day of my career and the saddest. We became too good at what we did." For the Japanese survivors, silence became a lifetime companion. Petty Officer Kenji Sato, one of the few from Shirayuki who lived, never forgot the screams in the water. He returned to Japan, raised a family, but each March he would visit the shore and bow toward the south. When asked why, he answered simply, "Because they're still there." In 1973, a joint memorial service was held in La, Papua New Guinea. For the first time, veterans from both sides met, Americans, Australians, and Japanese. They stood together by the sea that had once divided them. A moment of silence followed. Only the sound of waves, eternal, indifferent, filled the air. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most studied engagements of the 20th century. It proved that strategy was no longer measured in ships or artillery, but in air power and intelligence. It reshaped doctrines, rewrote textbooks, and taught commanders around the world that control of the sky is the key to survival. But behind every chart and report lies the truth. 3,500 souls lost in 2 days. Men who believed they were heroes of an empire, until the sea turned against them. 80 years later, the waves still break gently over the graves of the fallen. Fishermen pass over them without knowing the history that sleeps below. But sometimes when the sun sets red over the Bismarck Sea, locals say the water still glows, as if the fire never went out. Perhaps it's just light on the waves, or perhaps it's memory. History isn't just about who won. It's about who paid the price. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea reminds us that every triumph comes at a human cost, and that understanding the past isn't about glorifying war, but ensuring we never repeat it. So when you see the calm ocean today, remember, beneath it lies a story of courage, strategy, and tragedy, a story written in fire and sealed by the sea. Because in March 1943, over the waters of New Guinea, the world learned a truth that still echoes today. No empire lasts forever, but the memory of those who fought beneath its flag must never be forgotten.